The unspoken code of a lone wolf empath. Imagine standing in a packed conference room where no one is speaking, yet the air is thick with unspoken tension. Curious. Two executives sit across from each other, exchanging polite head nods and dynamic corporate pleasantries. On paper, everything appears calm, productive, and aligned. But in the back of the room, one specific individual feels a sudden, sharp spike in their own heart rate. Exhales sharply. Their chest tightens. Their palms grow faintly cold. Why? Because their brain is not merely reading the spoken words, it is decoding the invisible emotional climate of the room. What you are observing is not intuition or magical premonition, it is the neurological architecture of a lone wolf empath. For decades, behavioral science and psychology have categorized human interaction into neat boxes: introverts versus extroverts, leaders versus followers, thinkers versus feelers. But when we look closely at high level emotional intelligence, we discover a rare neurological profile, an individual equipped with an exceptionally sensitive mirror neuron system, paired with an instinctual drive for strategic solitude. Most people walk into a room and hear speech. A lone wolf empath walks into a room and experiences an invisible torrent of micro-expressions, suppressed anxieties, microaggression cues, and unexpressed desires. They are living radar systems. However, this level of perceptual clarity carries a hidden, compounding tax. When your brain is wired to continuously download the unedited emotional data of everyone around you, standard social settings become sensory battlegrounds. Without a clear blueprint, this extraordinary gift turns into an overwhelming vulnerability. Many default to complete social isolation, not because they dislike people, but because retreat is the only way their nervous system can clear the noise. They become the lone wolf by necessity rather than choice. What if the solitude you seek isn't a social weakness, but an uncalibrated superpower? What if the emotional exhaustion you feel at the end of every workday isn't a personal flaw, but a predictable consequence of a brain operating without emotional armor? In this session, we will break open the neuroscience, the psychological mechanics, and the strategic mastery behind this unique disposition. We will examine why traditional emotional self-help advice fails this specific group and lay out the exact cognitive framework required to master the unspoken code. Exploring how deep empathic awareness functions not as a passive emotional state, but as a sophisticated biological tool for processing micro-expressions, tonal shifts, and unseen group dynamics. Why lone wolves retreat, not out of a disinterest in people, but to escape emotional cognitive overload and regulate a hyper-reactive nervous system. How brain systems automatically absorb the distress of surrounding environments, and why self-regulation requires strategic, intentional boundaries. How chronic emotional absorption without self-preservation leads to burnout, boundary collapse, and compassion fatigue. Harnessing high emotional intelligence, EQ, to transition from reactive absorption to proactive leadership, turning solitary sensitivity into a strategic asset. Hyperattunement is often mistakenly framed as a mystical or purely sentimental experience. Yet when we analyze human interaction through the lens of modern behavioral neuroscience, we discover that it is fundamentally an advanced evolutionary mechanism. Long before human beings developed sophisticated linguistic structures or formal diplomacy, survival depended entirely on the rapid, subconscious decoding of environmental threats and group dynamics. A slight shift in a tribe member's posture, an unexpected tremor in a voice, or a fleeting micro-expression of fear could mean the difference between immediate danger and safety. In this context, hyperattunement evolved not as a passive, gentle state of emotional openness, but as a highly calibrated biological detection system designed to read the unseen room. In individuals who embody the Lone Wolf Empath profile, this primal scanning mechanism operates at an extraordinarily high gain setting. From a neurobiological standpoint, this phenomenon relies heavily on the mirror neuron system, a complex neural network that fires both when an individual executes an action and when they observe that exact same action performed by another. While a standard neurotypical response involves a modest level of cognitive empathy, hyperattunement triggers a profound physiological reflex. When a person with this neural architecture enters a room, their brain begins an immediate high bandwidth download of microdata. They do not merely observe that a colleague is stressed. Their own nervous system simulates the somatic markers of that stress, the subtle elevation in heart rate, the slight restriction of breathing, the unexpressed tension held in the jawline. This process, scientifically understood as emotional contagion, occurs below the threshold of conscious awareness. The hyperattuned individual acts as an emotional conductor, absorbing and mirroring the acoustic properties of speech, vocal inflection, pitch variations, and body language that others overlook. What looks like simple intuition to an outside observer is actually the brain processing hundreds of nonverbal cues per second and synthesizing them into an immediate visceral realization. It is an extraordinary perceptual capability, allowing for an uncanny ability to detect deception, spot hidden anxieties, and recognize organizational or interpersonal discord long before it manifests verbally. However, the evolutionary trade-off for carrying such an advanced diagnostic tool is immense. Because the human brain consumes significant glucose and metabolic energy to process sensory input, living in a constant state of biological hypervigilance carries a severe physiological cost. When an environment is saturated with hostility, implicit bias, or unspoken panic, the hyperattuned nervous system treats those invisible emotional signals as immediate physical realities. The autonomic nervous system remains chronically activated in a low-grade fight-or-flight state, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline. The individual is forced to constantly filter out external noise just to maintain internal baseline stability. Thus, far from being a passive personality quirk, hyperattunement is a continuous high-stakes cognitive operation, a sophisticated evolutionary trait that provides unmatched perceptual clarity but demands rigorous neurological regulation to prevent total systemic exhaustion. The paradox of solitude lies at the very core of why individuals with high emotional attunement frequently retreat from the world, giving rise to the archetype of the lone wolf. To the outside observer, this deliberate withdrawal is often mischaracterized as emotional coldness, social anxiety, or a fundamental disinterest in human connection. Yet, when we examine this behavior through the framework of cognitive load theory and autonomic nervous system regulation, a completely different reality emerges. The decision to seek isolation is rarely an act of rejection aimed at others. Rather, it is a necessary calculated strategy to recover from severe emotional cognitive overload and reset a hyper-reactive nervous system. In standard social interactions, the average mind processes verbal cues, explicit body language, and conscious dialogue. For the hyperattuned individual, however, every social environment presents a chaotic storm of incoming data. Their heightened mirror neuron activity forces them to process not just what is being said, but every unspoken tension, suppressed hostility, subtle micro-expression, and unarticulated insecurity in the room. This continuous stream of nonverbal input creates an extraordinary degree of cognitive friction. The brain's prefrontal cortex, tasked with managing executive function and impulse control, becomes flooded by the sheer volume of affective information it must filter, analyze, and regulate simultaneously. When this emotional input exceeds the mind's bandwidth, the result is mental and physical saturation. The sympathetic nervous system responds to this continuous stream of external stimuli as a form of chronic environmental stress, maintaining elevated levels of cortisol and keeping the body in a state of perpetual vigilance. In this state, even simple social pleasantries demand an unsustainable amount of metabolic energy. The sensory processing sensitivity that makes these individuals so perceptive also makes prolonged exposure to dense social environments biologically exhausting. Therefore, solitude serves an indispensable physiological purpose. It is the controlled environment where the inflow of external emotional data drops to zero. In complete isolation, the individual's nervous system can finally transition out of its defensive, high vigilance state and engage the parasympathetic response, allowing the heart rate to decelerate, muscle tension to dissipate, and baseline neurochemical equilibrium to restore itself. Away from the subconscious burden of mirroring everyone else's emotional states, the lone wolf empath can finally untangle their own genuine feelings from the absorbed emotions of those around them. This creates the underlying paradox. The very people who possess the deepest capacity for empathy and connection are often the ones who require the most significant amounts of solitary time. Their retreat is not a symptom of detachment or a defect in their social architecture, but a vital mechanism for emotional self-preservation. Without these routine periods of solitude to flush out accumulated emotional noise and repair systemic burnout, their capacity for clear perception and meaningful interaction completely collapses. Solitude, then, is not an escape from reality, but the deliberate cultivation of a quiet space necessary to regain clarity, maintain personal boundaries, and protect the integrity of their inner life. Emotional contagion represents one of the most fundamental yet misunderstood processes governing human social dynamics, operating as the primary neural engine behind high-level empathy. At its core, this phenomenon describes the automatic, subconscious tendency to mimic and synchronize movement, vocalizations, postures, and facial expressions with another person, ultimately causing a convergence of emotional states. While this process occurs to varying degrees across the human species, it reaches its absolute apex within the brain architecture of the lone wolf empath, primarily driven by an exceptionally sensitive mirror neuron network. These specialized mirror neurons act as a biological bridge between internal subjective experience and external observation. When you witness someone experiencing acute stress, panic, or sorrow, your mirror neuron architecture does not simply register that emotion abstractly or intellectually. Instead, it activates the exact same somatic and neural pathways within your own brain, effectively simulating the other person's neurochemical state inside your own body. For an individual with hyperattunement, this mirroring mechanism operates at an extraordinarily high gain setting. When exposed to an environment fraught with conflict or anxiety, their brain instantly begins downloading that ambient emotional atmosphere, translating external interpersonal distress into immediate physical symptoms such as elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, and sudden muscle constriction. This automatic absorption occurs long before the conscious mind has an opportunity to evaluate or rationalize what is happening. The human brain is built to continuously adapt to its environment, and for a hypersensitive nervous system, the emotional state of another human being is the immediate environment. If a colleague enters a meeting carrying unexpressed resentment, or if a partner carries hidden grief, the empath's neurobiology instantly reacts to those covert signals. It is a biological response so swift and pervasive that the individual often mistakes these absorbed emotions for their own genuine feelings, creating profound psychological confusion and rapid energy depletion. Because emotional contagion operates on such a primitive pre-verbal level, attempting to manage it through sheer willpower or positive thinking is fundamentally ineffective. When your mirror neurons are constantly firing in response to ambient tension, your prefrontal cortex, The Center for Executive Functioning, Decision-Making, and Emotional Regulation is continually forced to spend precious metabolic resources managing external noise. Over time, without deliberate intervention, this constant state of emotional resonance leads directly to systemic burnout, chronic emotional fatigue, and a completely dysregulated nervous system. Navigating this reality requires moving beyond simple intuitive feeling into strategic neural management. To counteract the relentless pull of emotional contagion, an individual must cultivate an intellectual awareness of their own physiological baseline. Understanding that mirror neurons create an illusion of shared ownership over emotions is the critical first step towards self-preservation. It demands the building of intentional psychological boundaries that act as a circuit breaker between observation and absorption, ensuring that while the brain remains capable of perceiving another person's inner state with remarkable precision, it refrains from automatically taking on the physical burden of that state as its own. The shadow side of unregulated empathy represents a profound, often invisible crisis that emerges when extraordinary sensitivity operates without structural boundaries. In psychological and organizational research, high empathy is routinely praised as an unquestioned virtue associated with exceptional leadership, rapport building, and interpersonal intelligence. However, when an individual possesses a hyperreactive capacity to absorb the emotional states of others without an active mechanism for self-preservation, this presumed virtue steadily mutates into a destructive, high-stakes liability. The uncalibrated empath becomes a passive sponge for human suffering, chronic anxiety, and environmental conflict, setting off a predictable cascade of psychological, cognitive, and physical decay. At the center of this breakdown is the phenomenon known as compassion fatigue, a state of profound emotional and mental exhaustion resulting from prolonged exposure to the stress and trauma of others. Unlike standard occupational stress, which usually stems from workload or time pressures, compassion fatigue strikes at the very capacity for caring itself. As the unregulated empath continuously absorbs the distress, grievances, and unspoken tensions of those around them, their internal emotional reserves are relentlessly drained without replenishment. The nervous system, kept in a state of perpetual low-grade emergency by constant exposure to external stressors, eventually undergoes a defensive shutdown. The individual finds themselves drifting into emotional numbness, depersonalization, and cynicism, ironically losing the very empathy that once defined their interaction with the world. This trajectory is further accelerated by the systematic collapse of personal boundaries. Without clear, enforced limits on emotional availability, the unregulated empath develops an unhealthy sense of responsibility for the well-being of everyone in their orbit because they feel the discomfort of others as directly as their own. They are often compulsively driven to fix, soothe, or mitigate the emotional turbulence around them just to achieve personal relief. This creates a toxic dynamic where personal boundaries dissolve completely. The individual becomes incapable of saying no, continuously overcommitting their mental and physical resources to appease others, and swallowing their own needs to maintain interpersonal harmony. The systemic toll of this dynamic manifests directly in chronic burnout and physical somatic symptoms. When the prefrontal cortex is constantly forced to process an overwhelming flood of external affective data, executive functioning degrades significantly. Decision-making becomes paralyzed, focus declines, and emotional regulation fails, leading to sudden bursts of uncharacteristic irritability or complete cognitive paralysis. Physiologically, the sustained elevation of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline disrupts sleep architecture, weakens immune response, and induces chronic muscle tension and digestive distress. The body begins to physically mirror the unresolved emotional chaos it has absorbed from its environment. Ultimately, the dark side of empathy reveals that feeling deeply in the absence of emotional discipline is not a superpower. It is a form of self-sabotage. When sensitivity lacks structure, compassion devolves into codependency, and understanding becomes a pathway to personal erosion. Protecting the self is not an act of selfishness, but a prerequisite for sustained clarity. Without strict cognitive boundaries and active energy management, high empathy inevitably consumes the very person who carries it. Mastering the unspoken code requires a fundamental paradigm shift, transitioning from a state of passive emotional absorption to one of proactive strategic self-regulation. For the lone wolf empath, high emotional sensitivity is often experienced as an unpredictable storm, a continuous, involuntary inflow of external moods, unspoken anxieties, and environmental tensions. However, when paired with high emotional intelligence, EQ, this high-gain sensory setting ceases to be a liability. It transforms into an unparalleled asset for high-level decision-making, negotiation, and authentic leadership. The essence of this code lies in learning how to decouple perception from absorption, allowing an individual to read the room with absolute precision without carrying the emotional weight of what they observe. The first crucial step in this mastery is developing what behavioral science terms cognitive empathy or perspective taking as a counterweight to pure affective empathy. Affective empathy is the automatic, biological process of feeling what another person feels through mirror neuron activation. It is raw, visceral, and exhausting. Cognitive empathy, by contrast, is an intellectual framework. It allows an individual to understand another person's emotional state, motivations, and mental model without taking on their physiological stress. By conscious practice, the lone wolf empath learns to install a mental barrier between the initial observation of a nonverbal cue and their own neurochemical response. The observed emotional data is analyzed as valuable information rather than integrated as personal reality. This transition from reactive feeling to strategic insight depends on the rigorous application of internal boundaries. Boundaries, in this context, are not physical walls or acts of social aggression. They are precise cognitive protocols that define where one person's emotional responsibility ends and another's begins. When entering high-stress environments, the individual operating under the unspoken code actively establishes a sense of psychological distance. They cultivate an internal observer state, a composed, detached awareness that monitors micro-expressions, tonal shifts, and group dynamics while keeping their own autonomic nervous system completely baseline and calm. This creates a powerful operational advantage. While others are blinded by hot-headed emotional reactivity, the regulated empath remains cool, clear, and strategically aligned. Furthermore, mastering this code enables the lone wolf empath to redefine the nature of leadership and interpersonal influence. Traditional models of leadership often emphasize dominant, high-visibility charisma. Yet, in complex, high-stakes environments, the quiet, hyper-perceptive leader possesses a far deeper advantage. Because they are finely attuned to the subtle emotional undercurrents of a team, they can identify hidden burnout, detect unexpressed conflict, and gauge authentic buy-in long before these factors surface as overt problems. They do not need to dominate the conversation. Their strength comes from an ability to listen deeply, evaluate hidden motives, and act with decisive, calculated clarity. Ultimately, the mastery of the unspoken code is about turning raw, uncalibrated vulnerability into disciplined strength. Solitude is no longer used as a desperate escape from total exhaustion, but as a deliberate practice for strategic reflection and baseline recovery. Sensitivity is no longer viewed as a personal defect that requires social withdrawal, but as a refined instrument for navigating human complexity. By combining deep empathic capacity with rigorous self-regulation, clear boundaries, and cognitive discipline, the lone wolf steps out of the passive shadows of emotional burnout and into the full power of calm, grounded, and highly intelligent leadership.